Hello, we welcome you back to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix Podcast. Today with your hosts Bernhard and Laura Matsu. And the topic of this episode is the difference between matrix relationships and evolutionary relationships. That's a very important and relevant topic in this day and age that's coming up for many people we see, also with the work Laura and I are doing. So we want to dive deeper into this topic and all that it entails. But before we dive into, I just want to announce again that we have another round coming up, the fifth round of our private group coaching program, Time of Transition Embodied Soul Awakening. And it starts August 23rd until November 2nd. It is limited to 25 people and is by application only. So the enrollment and application phase has started. You guys can apply in the link below in the info section and find out more about it on my website, veilofreality.com. And, this course is really a foundational course we have developed over the years based on our experience of really decades of working with people one-on-one with thousands of people, literally from our retreats as well, in our own inner work and studies and experiences to really combine the necessary inner work in this day and age with the quote outer work, right? That's really also the foundation of the work on my website and the uniqueness of the program to bring both together, because we really need to become the spiritual warriors in this day and age and step up to the plate, because obviously, there is the crackdown of the matrix forces. We see this in the world out there, but it has triggered an awakening as well. So there's definitely an awakening happening, but we need to stand up to the plate, so to speak, answer the call and do the necessary inner work on an holistic level. And this program is based on what we call the fourfold approach of holistic self-work, working on all levels: physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual, the inner work, holistically integral in context of the outer work, right? In light of the matrix forces, the globalists, what we're seeing happening right now, how we can counteract the anti-divine forces, but also in light of the evolution of consciousness, right? And divine will and what is trying to anchor itself here. And really the shadows coming out in the collective and within ourselves. So also shadow work is the name of the game. And again, it's August 23rd until November 22nd, limited to 25 people. The application process has already started. Find out more about it at veilofreality.com or in the info section. And yes, some of the topics we'll be exploring is, as I just mentioned, right, the fourfold approach of holistic self-work, what it truly entails, the traps on the path towards awakening. And also, we start you guys off on the foundational body-mind practice, because it is important, very important, to get out of our heads into our bodies. And it will be put into context of the evolution of consciousness. We are also looking at through the lens of evolutionary astrology, which listeners know is Laura's expertise. That's very profound. That's not your typical mainstream astrology. It's more esoteric type of astrology. It looks deep into soul purpose, lessons, karma, and past lives. And then obviously we look into shadow work, because shadow work is the name of the game, right? We see it happen coming out in the world and within ourselves. So we need to apply conscious shadow work, which seems to be some sort of hyped word in this day and age, but still don't see many people truly understanding the principles, let alone really truly apply it. So we dive deeper into that. Also basic trauma work, childhood wounds, and all of that. That's coming up for us in many different ways. So we need to engage in this necessary psychological work so we don't fall into the trap of spiritual bypassing. And we really approach it somatically. So it's not just talk therapy. So we have all kinds of many different practices, exercises that really approach this work on a foundational level and with great results based on the participants that have joined the courses so far. And we also look, into fringe and the occult knowledge, hyperdimensional matrix, entity interferences, psychic attacks, the popular Agent Smith syndrome, right? If you're aware of it, that's really prevalent in this day and age, and how we can handle these forces, right? In context of the inner work to close off the entry points. We also be looking into how to access the true self, right? Most of us, we identify with the false personality, but we need to connect to our true self and essentially to our deeper intuition and the higher mind as well. So we do not look outside for guidance anymore, but can trust ourselves more and more. And obviously ties also into emotional intelligence and all of that. And ultimately, it's also about building a relationship to the divine. So we look into that because we need to bring God and the divine into the picture. But obviously, we're not talking about some dogmatic God outside of ourselves, but accessing the divine within. And how can we do it? How can we work consciously with prayer and assisting forces that are all around us so we can enter the flow of life with more faith and trust? Ties into understanding universal laws, timeline, realm dynamics, because as we have talked about before, we are going through a splitting within humanity, right? There's a natural splitting based on level of being and soul embodiment. So it's important to understand that as well. Ties also into reality creation and soul resonance, and ultimately aligning with divine will, which is our true essence and a deeper soul purpose for being here. And ultimately, we also obviously we'll look into spiritual warriorship and what that entails, because we don't want to use spirituality as an escape from the world, but to step up to the plate as a spiritual warriors in service to the divine. So we need to really apply the warrior archetype in our everyday life. And last but not least, obviously, as many of you have already experienced or are experiencing, relationships take on a whole new level when on the path of seeking truth and self-work. So we dive deeper into evolutionary relationships and evolutionary conscious relationships. And we will also then talk about this more in this podcast.
Yeah, so how it basically works, those are topics we're getting into, is we kind of follow a bit of a similar routine as we did on our retreats, meaning we do weekly or bi-weekly. We have a yoga, meditation routine, qigong, exercises. So it's really experiential. And we also give people self-work exercises to work on themselves, as well as like hours and hours of video that you can watch on these topics. So it's not just learning about these mentally. We go through the process in a group. We all engage in a spiritual practice. And then we have a private group just for the people who have entered the program, where they can share experiences, as well as we have weekly Zoom calls where we do sharing circles. You can ask any questions, and we do coaching with the group. So it is really like an intensive experience. It is really a group experience as well. And it's completely holistic. So this is not your, it's not just a mental educational program. We're really guiding you through specific embodiment practices so that you can really understand these concepts experientially, because my perspective and my experience is that you can do all the intellectual learning in the world, but until you actually have a direct experience of something, you're not really getting it. So direct experience with shadow work, direct experience working with your triggers, direct experience accessing the true self, like all of that is our basic aim. And it is really important too to have that community aspect. It's really beautiful seeing people connect in times like these. I think it's also a kind of community repair, since a lot of people are exchanging friends and exchanging their own belief systems over the past couple of years, and a lot of shifts have been happening. So we're really trying to kind of anchor a greater kind of Aquarian brotherhoods, uniting humanity across the globe with a common aim, which I feel is to really use these times to work on ourselves in a deep way, and using the group container to do that. So yeah.
So thanks for pointing out. That's very important to note that this course is experiential, because it's not just about intellectual information. We have all the information out there. In fact, there's an information overload. And you cannot initiate change alone just by sharing information or reading information or trying to present others with information. It should be more than obvious right now that a lot of people you cannot reach by facts, information, or common sense alone, or even reason. So we need to engage in the deeper work to change our, not only our being, but to connect to our true essence. And we need do this experientially with practical effort, so to speak. right? Because as many of you, for example, figured out or seen in yourself, you can delude yourself, that you maybe, for example, understand a certain issue or a certain problem in your life intellectually, what relates to childhood, whatever it may be, but the body has not processed it. So as Laura said, it's not just, especially not getting into talk therapy or story, but the somatic approach. And we have very powerful practices and exercises that go deep within all that.
Okay, so if you want to join us, I recommend you hop on soon because we're almost halfway full and we haven't even really promoted it. So it seems to be getting more popular and more popular. But you can go to Veil of Reality, Bernhard's website, under courses. Also, the link is in the info section. So yeah, and one of the topics that we actually get into in the program is this idea of evolutionary relationships. So just to define that, we do see that there's a potential for relationships to evolve. And basically what they've evolved from is first my own grandparents' generation, who lived during World War I, World War II. The relationships were primarily based on security, so physically based relationships. So my grandmother married my grandmother because, he was going to be the caretaker, traditional gender roles, etc. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they were based mainly on security. People got married very young. And then what that moved into, which is my own parents' generation and even people who I see out in the world today, primarily relationships that are based on mutual interests, so hobbies, shared pastimes, activities, intellectual, and relationships that are based on emotions and conditional love. So I would say that these three types of relationships are the most common out there. And relationships that were based on emotions and conditional love is probably the most dominant, at least in Western culture. So this means the reason it's conditional love is because it often is based off of projections, romantic projections that happen in the early phase of dating, where your partner is like the most amazing person in the world and they're perfect and can never do any wrong. And these emotions and these strong emotional positive projections are often based off of unmet childhood needs. Not that there's anything wrong with those being present, but it's really important if you want to bring more consciousness to your relationships that you're able to, observe your projections, understand why they're there, understand what they're telling you, rather than think that your partner is your projections. So that's really clear. That's really important to even just develop clarity on who is this person in front of me that I've fallen in love with, because a lot of the times people actually fall in love with their projections of the person. Then they get married or get in a relationship with someone. They don't end up being the person that they projected them to be. And then they end up feeling disappointed, right? When the reality is it's actually, if you want to bring more consciousness to your relationships, you actually have to take back your projections. So that's the most common relationship that we see, these relationships based on emotions and conditional love. And then what we're seeing, or what I think is going to be happening with a lot of people, is we have this next stage of relationships where they're based off of true love, which means essence to essence as opposed to personality to personality. So for the most part, essence is who you truly are. It's not your conditioning. It's not who you learned how to be through the world. It's just your pure essential nature, your true nature. That's essence. Whereas for the most part, most relationships that you see out of there, which I would define as matrix-based relationships, are actually based off of false personality to false personality. So a lot of these people who are getting involved in these relationships, which are based off of projections, conditional love, even mutual interest or whatever, they don't even know themselves, so they can't evolve to this next level of relationship. So let me just finish this off. And so when the relationship is primarily based off of essence to essence, doesn't mean you don't have triggers, wounds, or whatever stuff to work through, then the relationship can be used as a container for spiritual growth. And ultimately, the relationship is between you and the other person and the divine. It's not just you and the other person. So this is the next phase of relationships we see is becoming available However, it does take a prerequisite in being able to, number one, be committed to growth. Both people need to be committed to growth and having some level of conscious relationship skills so that you can even use the relationship to evolve. Because if you don't know how to actually use any relationship in your life to evolve, you can't enter a relationship that's based on that. It's just common sense. You're going to say something?
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I just wanted to also point out, that of the title, the difference between matrix relationships and evolutionary relationships. So we define, quote unquote, basically matrix relationships that are based on the first three Laura mentioned, based on security, physical survival, or just mutual interest as hobbies. And the other one, emotional or conditional love, right? Based on the projections or unmet childhood wounds we project, or needs we project on the partner, trying to get it from them. And I also wanted to point out that's really key to understand personality versus essence, because most people mistake the true self or mistake the personality for the true self, right? So They think they are with their their conditioning, programming, even wounding, trauma, their identifications, and all of that. And so they look somebody to match personality with personality, but that will never bring true fulfillment and true, quote unquote, happiness. It only happens if you connect with your true self, the true self. And what is needed for that is also the foundation in the divine to really know thyself, right? So we do not, personality always tries to fulfill itself externally. So any relationship you enter out of like neediness or feeling alone or just trying to use somebody else to fulfill your happiness, that's based on, that's kind of like, quote unquote, a matrix relationship based on personality as opposed to essence.
And this also doesn't just relate to romantic relationships, although that seems to be when the emotions are the strongest and the projections are the strongest. But even friendships, like you could have friends where there isn't any amount of depth in the connection. You just share things in common, quote unquote, but you don't share deeper things in common. Like you don't share a similar value system. You don't share a similar vision for the world, And what I see basically going on, and we've talked about this in another episode, which I can highly recommend, Does Everyone Have the Potential to Wake Up? Is that a lot of people are basically individuating because of the past year. They're starting to question the consensus, question the status quo. This also is a necessary stage on the quote unquote moving into the spiritual path, is this individuation process where your old friends, your old relationships are no longer in alignment with the person that you're becoming. And it is a painful process often to go from that kind of consensus matrix way of living and all of your relationships that are in that reality to a truly individuated state. So, I can just share an experience that I had, we've talked about this on other podcasts, but in 2012, I had an intense awakening experience where based off of me recovering from a serious addiction, I prayed to the divine. I had all these experiences of kind of divine intervention in my life. And I basically rebuilt my whole life from mind, body, and spirit. However, I had all sorts of friends from the era of my life up until then, which is actually my Saturn return, if anyone's into astrology. It was my nodal opposition to my Saturn return. But I had a bunch of old friends from this old era before I actually started turning to inner work, self-work, and mainly my own spiritual practice. That was the big shift. I went from pretty much someone who was not involved in any sort of spiritual stuff, even though I was into astrology, to being completely committed to a daily practice. And I had all sorts of friends left over from that era who, as I started to develop and focus more on spiritual self-work, the gap between us got wider and wider. And it was the only way that I could relate to them is if I started acting as a false personality, i.e. the person that I was. And I see this happening in a lot of people we coach with is they start to change. And then the people around them are still the same. And then this gap between them gets wider and wider and more uncomfortable the more that you commit to growth, because you can only kind of meet them at their level, but they're not able to meet you at their level because they haven't made that commitment to growth. So eventually there becomes a choice and there becomes a clash of value systems, I think, at a certain point. Especially over the past year, it's easy to pretend and get along with the consensus state when, there isn't this much polarization in the world, but it's become much harder and harder. And the reason being is because the consensus state is being trained to that anyone who's individuating outside of the grand narrative of COVID is an enemy, is basically, they're literally even calling people who don't get vaccinated variant factories. It's like the new term. So, it's very different these days being someone who's individuating, who's evolving and trying to get along with these matrix-based relationships. And I'm not saying it's not possible, but you will not be able to be met at your level if you're involving yourself in these relationships which you've grown past. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I also want to just add to that, it's a very important topic, because also the reason we brought up this topic, which we also go in much more depth into the course, because we see this in the people we've been working with, be it 101 or course participants, who are on the verge of, leaving the consensus state, so to speak, and starting to become individuated. And there's kind of like, how can I say, like a transition phase, and you can move back and forth, and there's a lot of struggle or stuff, like uncertainty, or people are not clear because they still cannot let go. And we see this in personal relationships, in couples, right? One partner, quote unquote, wakes up, starts to seek truth, engage in the work, but the other partner doesn't, right? And there's still, they maybe sometimes trying to hold on, hope the partner changes, or trying to make him or her wake up, which you cannot do by force, and you need to respect free will, right? Or it happens within family and friends, right? Where like one person wakes up, and then people have a lot of struggle, that they cannot be their authentic self to the family, because then ties into attachment versus authenticity. So it's important to be authentic, but then you may lose relationships. And that's what we have noticed keeps people truly from individuating, from becoming their own authority, so to speak, and really progress in the evolutionary road or path, because they're still holding on to old relationships that are outdated. And it's not about demonizing whatnot. It's just like understanding that everybody has their own soul progression and soul path.
And I just have to say, that loss of relationship is going to happen whether, and I'm not just saying that you need to just move on, not be friends with these people, but what I've noticed is that the relationship that you once had with them has to die once you start growing, you know? So if for me, for the example that I gave, a lot of my friends were actually social justice warrior leftists for the most part, because I grew up in that kind of liberal, hippie environment. And as my own beliefs changed, the only way that I had to basically pretend to be a different person in order to be around them. So I had to grieve the loss of the connection that I once had with a lot of people when I was on their level, when I was able to talk with them in the same ideological framework that they were into, right? So that's what needs to be grieved, is like the loss of relationship needs to be grieved, whether you need to move on from that relationship and find new friends, or you just realize that the way that I was relating to this person can no longer be because I've changed and I don't relate to myself like that anymore. And then realize that there's a new phase of relating. And that's what I had to go through as well.
So on that note, also what happens as well on that path, on this kind of like individuating path, it's about facing loneliness. Right, because that will come up as well. Yes, and that keeps or prevents people sometimes from letting go. And there's also some sort of obligation, especially with blood family and whatnot. And it's not about turning against them and calling them sheeple. It's just understanding, that relationships need to change in this day and age. Hence, evolutionary relationships. And as Laura just mentioned, it's not just one-on-one intimate relationships, but all relationships. Because if you think about it, all there is are relationships, how you relate, period, right? To your friends, family, strangers, online, offline, it is about relating. And as you change deep within, then the outside world would change as well, according to the Hermetic principle, as within, so without, as without, so within, right? But what I've seen, a lot of people, then they feel loneliness and they attach themselves to outdated relationships from their old personality self because they don't want to be alone. But facing loneliness is a very important aspect of the path.
It's an important aspect of the individuation process.
Exact individuation process, because ultimately loneliness, the lesson of loneliness is to, be by yourself, not to fulfill yourself with other people, other things, or just to keep busy, just to bypass your loneliness. And the lesson of loneliness is to find solitude within yourself, connect to essence, to who you truly are, and ultimately to the divine, which is the most important relationship.
Yeah, and that loneliness is a very extremely, and you can't skip that process of individuation, because what you're doing is you're kind of withdrawing your identification on the consensus reality. And I mean consensus reality, and I'll just go over this again for those who didn't hear the other podcast, is like the consensus is the mainstream, is basically the matrix. So these are anyone who basically conforms to the ideas of society, their culture. They get their values, their sense of meaning of life, their morals, and their sense of what is right, wrong from whatever society tells them. So that's what they identify with. And then when we start, they're basically very conditioned by the times that they live in. That's all, that they can't step outside the box, right? And then what happens in the first stage of the individuated state is you start to individuate, you start to realize there's something different about you that can't be defined by the consensus reality that you were born in. There's something very unique about you. You start to just feel different, right? And then what happens is you start to individuate from this consensus state. And this very first stage of individuation, usually people try to compensate for their inner feeling of alienation by trying to appear normal. So even though there's something different about them, they may even have unique interests. They may start listening to like this podcast, for instance, but be very trapped in a matrix job. They'll still try to have a normal life, normal job, normal friends, normal appearance. Yet inwardly, they would start to feel, I can no longer identify with this reality. Because they're still attached to the consensus and the sense of security / even belonging, familiarity that it provides. And the reason that they're still attached to this security and familiarity that their quote unquote normal life provides is because there's been unmet needs in childhood around core being validated for who they truly were in childhood. So they're still trying to get the unmet needs, the unmet validation needs from childhood met from the outside world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then to the extent that you haven't resolved those unmet childhood needs, you're still going to try to look for approval from your friends, from your family, from your work. I'm okay. It's okay to be who I am. And you're never going to get it. This is why this is one of the hardest phases to enter from this kind of matrix way, consensus way of being into the individuated state. Because number one, you really have to become independent in your sense of yourself, meaning your sense of validation comes from just knowing it's okay to be yourself, that you're an amazing person and you have something valuable to offer the world just by the essence of being yourself. And you're not looking anymore for validation from the outside world. So that's the key thing.
Yeah. So that's very important to understand this, the transition, so to speak. And what you just mentioned, when, a lot of people can see this when they get out of consensus state and starting to individuate, it's like literally living in two realities or living two lives almost. Some people may even secretly, research the quote matrix, listen to podcasts, but still live,
That's
a
how
very
it begins.
matrix, how it begins.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, from within, a new reality opens up. And I would say that's then the true calling of the soul, the seed, the growth of the soul starts right there. When as Sri Aurobindo would say, the psychic being makes its emergence, is looking for some higher connection, some higher guidance connecting to essence, so to speak, to the divine. That's kind of like a little sprout. That's really when the spiritual journey also begins, because in the consensus state, people are not truly connected to their soul. All their beliefs, opinions are from the matrix hive mindset. And it ties also from, you can look at it, as you just mentioned, from the psychological perspective, meaning like, as you just mentioned, in the consensus state, unmet childhood needs are being trying to fulfilled from the outside, or from the esoteric perspective, right? The higher centers haven't been activated yet. Yeah, ties a bit into the topic from esoteric perspective, organic portals, soulless humans who just live on the first three chakras and haven't activated the higher chakras. But it's important to understand, many people mistake all kinds of things for their soul, which is not their soul. But the true soul growth also starts with the individuating process. And to go further with it, which I'm not sure we're going to touch here, but after the individuated state, then comes the spiritual state, right?
Yeah, that's why it is really important. And I've seen, like, I think the number one thing I see in people who spiritual bypass, actually, or there's a lot of people who have an intellectual understanding of spiritual concepts who haven't individuated. They're all of their beliefs, all of their thoughts, the person who they think they are is a reflection of the consensus state. So the hallmark of being individuated is being able to form opinions for yourself and being able to be like, okay, this is what I read. Is that true for me? Can I unpack that? And this is beyond critical thinking too. It's about really asking yourself deeper questions in life. What do I believe? Where do I get that belief from? Really, it's hard. It is a hard internal process to go through, because you really have to examine every aspect of your conditioning, where you got your beliefs about yourself from, where you got your beliefs about the world, and truly to discover what's unique about you. And I have to say, the reason that this moving from the kind of matrix consensus state into this more evolved state is so hard, because what happens is the consensus wants the consensus to stay the same. The matrix wants the matrix to stay the same. So if anyone starts to individuate within that consensus state, the consensus will backlash. And that's when you have the Agent Smiths try and keep you in line, being like, why do you think this about vaccines? It's obviously not what the CDC is telling us, and something is wrong with you, So there's always going to be this backlash against someone who's individuating and the consensus state. And that's why you have to not rely on these opinions of the consensus state to get your sense of value about yourself. This is when you make the step. The individuation process is the self, the capital self becomes the central resource. So I can speak out and say an unpopular opinion to even people who I know are going to disagree with me, because I don't need their validation. I don't care what they think of me. I'll hear them. I'll hear them out and be mature and listen to what they have to say. However, I am not depending on my sense of self on what they think of me or what they don't think of me, or if they agree with me and disagree with me. And that is such an important phase for the soul. And the only way that you can reach the spiritualized state is through the individuation process. So when a lot of people come in and be like, oh, but we're all one, there's no such thing as, they basically take this non-dualistic approach to reality, not realizing that the individuation process and realizing what's unique about you, what are your unique gifts to share with the world, is the only gateway to those higher spiritual experiences.
Yeah, exactly. So that's some very important points you touched upon. Number one, exactly. The consensus state is the matrix. That's where, when you start to individuate, that's how the ego slumber of the world of the collective tries to drag you back down. Hence, the occult forces, the hostile forces, whatever, work as Agent Smiths through others, trying to get you back in line, back into consensus state.
Yeah.
Right. And it also ties, the consensus state, you can equate it with what is called in esoteric Christianity, the general law, right? That puts everybody back into place who tries to escape the general law, so to speak, of the consensus state. And all that. So you see this mirrored in various different esoteric traditions, exactly that evolution. This is archetypal, right? Yeah. But yours, it's very important, because many people engage in spiritual bypassing because they get out of the some sort of awakening within the consensus, and they try to jump into the spiritual state, not understanding. Even Sri Aurobindo talked about the first stage of conscious evolution is to separate from the crowd. This is literally what he said, separate from the masses. And that's individuation process. And that's what even Carl Jung said, Sri Aurobindo, many other masters of modern age, that that's a paradox, before you can engage in deeper esoteric spiritual work and even unite with the divine, you need to build a healthy ego. Right, that's the individuation state, is building a healthy ego, which means not the conditioned ego. Right, that's a consensus state, but understanding that I'm not my personality. I need to connect to essence, my true self, individuated self, and personality needs to become a clear expression of essence. Right, that's the true individuated ego, separated, and then you move on to the spiritual state. So that's kind of the journey, and even like. The paradox was pointed out by Carl Jung when in his quote, and I'm paraphrasing, the first half of your life is about, creating your healthy integrated ego, and the second half of life is destroying it or getting rid of it. That's when you kind of connect more to your divine higher self, right?
Yeah.
But many people skip this step because of pop spirituality, new age stuff, like wanting to ascend to 5D and all of that, and misunderstanding of we are one. And the other thing, it's very important to understand what you just mentioned as well. And this is why it's so hard for people really to, it's called literally, that's many different parables in esoteric mysticism talk about this, the shift from consensus state to the individuated state as shown as crossing the threshold, right? And there's an initiatory process, and that also kind of somehow separates the wheat from the chaff. We're able to do that because if you still, there will be phases when, like you just mentioned, and like many people start to individuate, but they're still afraid to speak their truth, speak out because of fear of whatever other people may think of them, or attack, or conflict, or rejection, abandonment.
Yeah.
But you cannot avoid this. It will come up. And as long as you try to appease to everyone, as long as you avoid, there will be attacks or conflict or interferences. That's just part of the journey. Hence, you need to embody also the warrior archetype, the spiritual warrior, because this awakening is not like, again, we have talked about this before, this new age idea of just bliss, love, and light. No, it brings up a lot of resistance from the world, the collective slum, the consensus, and from within yourself, because as Laura just said, it will bring all your other stuff up you have avoided. You need to look sincerely within yourself, where your beliefs come from, your wounds, your traumas, all of which these occult forces or the ancient myth use to tag into, to drag you back into the consensus state.
Yeah, exactly. And so, what happens is once you start to individuate, and so basically in the first phase of individuation, you start to kind of develop different interests, but you keep them private from the consensus people in your life. So maybe you're even listening to this podcast and you would never be able, you would never be able to talk to anyone who about it, So then what happens is when in the first stage of individuation process, you kind of find these like safe groups where you can be individuated, right? And then what happens is in the second subdivision of the individuated state, this is where this really period of rebellion sinks in. And you're like, okay, I'm going to say what I think to the people around me. I don't care how they respond, and there can even be this feeling of alienation gets very strong. I would say that this feeling of alienation kind of goes hand in hand with loneliness. Alienation in the sense where you realize like there's something very different from me. I don't identify with the consensus matrix reality anymore, And so what happens is like the people then end up really identifying with the counterculture of society, and they become very critical of society at this stage, which reinforces almost a sense of self-righteousness around alienation. So, even this truther community or the spiritual community that develops, this is kind of like these countercultures of society, and they're almost like, it's like they're rebellion against society, which is really important to kind of shake off the conditioning of society. But that's also not the end of the individuated state. The end of the individuated state is when you start to actually become a truly unique and gifted individual. You find the unique gift that you have to help the consensus evolve. You're able to be in the consensus without identifying with the consensus, without getting triggered with the consensus. You could even have a consensus job, which is an expression of your individuation, but you're not identified with it anymore. So that's really key, is that if you want to move into the spiritualized state, it's like, are you individuated? Have you creatively self-actualized your life? And I see a lot of people who just engage in a lot of spiritual bypassing, and they just don't want to be a part of the world. They just want to disconnect. Yeah. So
that reminds me, it's classical. It ties into the hero's journey, right? Yeah. Of call the adventure, going through the whole process, finding yourself, the treasure, your divine self, your gifts, and then come back to the world with your gifts. Because the beginning of the individuality state is just more about rebelling against the world and all of that.
That's to shake off the conditioning.
Exactly. Yeah. But then you find within that your deeper calling, your deeper gifts as well, which you can contribute in terms of creation, help build a new world, and help consensus people to individuate, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you realize you didn't need a retreat of this world, but you have a higher level, a new level of being, of soul integration. And that's where the saying ties into being in this world, but not of this world. You're not affected as much as you would before negatively by the consensus state. Because you're your true self. You're not, thrown off by others anymore. You know who you are. Basically.
Yeah. So when you're highly individuated, you are really also actualizing. You manifest your role in society as a truly unique and gifted individual, So the most individuated people / most spiritualized people are said to evolve the next consensus state. So you have to understand there is a return back into the consensus state. So for me, I spent like a few years traveling, going to different countries or whatever. Then I came back into the world and I started working with people again. So that was my kind of return. And for everyone, it's different. But going back to the topic, of matrix relationships versus evolutionary relationships is that, if you start to individuate and all of your friends are kind of consensus reality friends, then eventually there will become a choice that has to only come from yourself. There is no right or wrong choice. Is like, is this relationship serving my highest good? Is this relationship helping me grow? And only you can answer that. And it's each individual is on their own path in doing that, And I know for myself, at one point I was still able to kind of be friends with a lot of my consensus friends, even though I could never share with them anything personal or even anything I was truly interested in because they didn't share similar interests as me, and that's the only way that they could relate to people is through similar interests. But then what happened over the past year, and I think this happened to many people, especially when I started speaking out against COVID and masks and lockdowns and all sorts of other stuff, especially the Trump word, is that my consensus friends started to attack me. And I was no longer just this weird kind of spiritual person. I became dangerous to them.
Yeah, the servants of the matrix.
Yes. And at that point, I was like, wow, this gap is getting so big and I have to let this relationship go. And even though the relationship was not really like contributing anything to me, there wasn't adequate, give or take. I also felt, not very connected to these people anymore. The important step is to take that, to go through that grieving process. And then usually I found what happens after that grieving process is the essential loneliness, the alienation comes up again, because then it's like, okay, then the wounded ego is like, well, and this is kind of what crossing the threshold has been like for me is like, well, I'm not going to have any friends. I'm too weird at this point, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of, and you do cross that point of no return, meaning the point of no return is you can no longer enter in the consensus / matrix reality and just be that false personality anymore. There becomes a point where you're like,
it's impossible.
It's not possible for you to go back. Yeah. And you will, and I felt that very viscerally at one point in my journey where I was like, if I keep doing yoga and meditation to the extent that I'm doing it, my consciousness is going to alter to the point where I will no longer be able to connect with people in the fake way that I was still able to do at the time. And then that's again, the divine for me had to be my central resource because I couldn't my sense of connection, belonging, my sense of security in the outer world had to completely dissolve.
Yeah, exactly. So what that also reminds me of this process of individuation, with regards to, relationships. And again, we talk about all relationships. It can be intimate, family, friends, whoever, right? Matrix relationship versus evolutionary relationships. So as you individuate more and more, also on the esoteric or metaphysical level, your soul resonance changes. You embody more essence, right? So your whole being changes, and then everything is interrelated, right? The outer, again, as above, so below, is within, so without. So that's your reality will actually change. And actually, the process of individuation is the true secret to reality creation, by the way, right? Beyond just visualizing your desires or positive thinking and all of that, or that's kind of the superficial new age distortion of it. But that's how you then actually create reality. And then the relationship, as Laura just mentioned, from the consensus state will go out of your life. And the more you stick true to yourself and the process of individuation, these relationships go out of your life actually very naturally. That's been my experience. I've been on this journey for quite some time. I mean, I was always been like in some sort of outsider, all of it. But, when I started my journey consciously more, like it's been already 25 years ago, early on, so many friends that were best friends back then, but part of the consensus state have gone naturally out of my life. So there was no necessity to, have a talk about it or whatnot. It's just natural and there's nothing wrong with it. So that's what we'll see. But if you still hold on to it, there will be a lot of friction, right? There will, because of certain unconscious attachments in all of that. And it's also very important to understand that the transition from consensus to individuated state does not happen by itself. It does not happen by just reading information on the internet, intellectually understanding the matrix. Yeah, this may be part of the journey, but ultimately it comes to the inner work. That's so key, the inner effort and the sincerity within yourself to do the work, like, for example, which we're also offering in the course and whatnot. So it's, how much you can individuate it is directly related, proportional to your own efforts and your sincerity to engage in the work. It's called the great work for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah. So the difference, I think the primary difference between matrix relationships and evolutionary relationships is that if you want to have any relationship, friendship in order to evolve, both people have to have a growth mindset.
Yeah.
So, and these are two entirely different mindsets, and they actually work across purposes to each other. So the fixed mindset, they want a partner or friends who just put them on a pedestal, maybe just go to movies, go to restaurants with them, share superficial things, and they want that friend to just, make them feel perfect and worship them, or a relationship rather. I'm thinking of it from a relationship context, but this also relates to friends. Whereas people with the growth mindset want relationships where both people are helping the other become a better person. So they want someone who can see their faults, help them work on them. They want someone who can challenge them, encourage them to learn new things, Fixed mindset people want total uncritical acceptance, and growth mindset people want to confront problems and use them as a tool for growth.
Yeah.
And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because this is the main difference between using relationships, just matrix relationships, and evolutionary relationships. Matrix relationships are very fixed, and then evolutionary relationships are 100% focused on growth. So these two mindsets are very incompatible in relationship, because what one person sees as growth, the fixed person's worst nightmare, basically.
So like a threat, basically.
Yeah, because so if you have a conflict with your friend, or you notice for me, it became basically impossible at a certain point, because I'm a millennial and a lot of my friends are woke people, very early adopters of woke ideology. But at a certain point, I couldn't actually speak my mind about the problems that I saw arising in this SJW culture, because I didn't have a growth mindset. And so it was like things were just problematic, things were just problematic and needed to be canceled, basically. And even, I had a conversation with a friend about certain unique interests that I saw arising, and they would just treat me like I was crazy or weird, So I was like, eventually at a point I was like, I can't even be myself in these relationships. What are they actually offering me? And that's a question I think we have to ask ourselves, is if you can't actually be who you truly are in a relationship, what is the relationship based on?
Yeah.
And I see that a lot. And, you have to, I think in order to grow and evolve, you really have to get comfortable with letting go, with grieving, and moving forward in life, and a lot of people aren't able to do that because of their own attachments based off of unmet childhood needs and the conditioning factors of childhood.
Yeah, exactly. So, Alexan, we are nearing the end of the first hour. And the second hour now, we want to dive deeper and really explore 8 very key points or key characteristics of an evolutionary relationship. So we want to talk about that. And we share a little bit more of also what then we go deep into the course with as well. Again, we have our Time of Transition Embodied Soul Awakening course coming up again, private coaching, group coaching program limited to 25 people. And the dates are August 23rd until November 2nd, 10 weeks, really diving deep, a lot of material, and Laura and I will be guiding you guys through this. And again, you can apply because it's by application only, through my website veilofreality.com under courses, or also in the info section there's the link to the application and more info about the course as well. And once you apply, we'll present you with more information. And yeah, if you are not a member yet on my website, to get access to the second hour of this podcast or any podcast, and also to the membership forum, please also sign up at veilofreality.com. And we also appreciate your support for our work. With that, having said that, see you guys on the other side and the second hour.